PONDering with CGR Undertow.
You know, one of the craziest things about growing up with video games, and now having played video games for like 25 years or something ridiculous, is watching how opinions within gaming shift. I'm starting to see people in YouTube comments, even on Twitter, and talking to people. They're starting to ask a question that I never, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago would have ever expected someone to ask, and that is, what is so special about Ocarina of Time? And I think a big part of it is the games you grew up with. I mean, what you have to understand is that during that era of games, the Nintendo 64, the original PlayStation, that generation, that was the very first time most of us had ever seen 3D graphics in a video game. Everything before that had been 2D, had been sprites. And then all of a sudden, you wake up one day and Mario 64 exists. And it really was mind-blowing. Mind-blowing in a way that it's not like now when a new console comes out and it's slightly better, it's packing a little bit more horsepower. This was something different. This was really the last radical change in video games was this era. And for most people, the game that took that the furthest, the game that really flew the flag for that radical change in video games was Ocarina of Time. I mean, as mind-blowing as it was to play Mario 64 for the first time, the most important moment in video games for me was playing Ocarina of Time and having Link, the moment Link walks out into Hyrule Field. That changed, that didn't, it's so cliche to say it changed video games. Not only did it change video games, it changed my perception and understanding of video games. And it did this for a lot of people because for the very first time now, you were looking at a game world that you had to apply like real world thought to. I had to get to that castle that was way over the hillside. I had to walk there. And time is passing. I need to get there before nighttime because obviously at night they closed the town, they raised the drawbridge. This was the first time ever that you had to look at a game world with this sort of real world logic because for the first time it was a real world that you were playing in. But it's so much more than just that technological wow factor. One of the coolest things about Ocarina of Time and that relationship that it builds between the player and the game world is how it uses that relationship to further the game's plot and to really have an emotional impact on the player. I mean, when you play in the first part of the game as Child Link, as young Link, you sort of crisscross Hyrule. You're going to all these different places where, for the most part, people are living in harmony. This world is a lovely place, and you meet all these people, you talk to all these people, you learn their sort of their routines and their schedules within Hyrule. You get to know a lot of these characters. And then when you come back 7 years later, everything's decimated. And things like that really have this emotional impact on the player. As if it wasn't enough to just know, based on the plot setup, that 7 years had passed, the game actually makes you feel like 7 years had passed. People made a big deal about the passage of time from day to night in Ocarina of Time, but it wasn't just that. A whole decade nearly had passed in Ocarina of Time. And the game actually made it feel like that happened. So it's such an amazingly well thought out game. It's not just the functional design of, is this fun? What am I doing? Z targeting. That stuff was all great and revolutionary. But it's the way the game was thought out, the way its relationship with the player was thought out, and the way the synergy between game worlds and passage of time and the way that all works out. That's what's so brilliant about Ocarina of Time. Like when someone asks me, especially like a younger gamer, they're like, Derek, what's so special about Ocarina of Time? You've even said in reviews that newer Zeldas play better, they look better. So what's so great about Ocarina of Time? That's not the best Zelda game anymore. And I always say, maybe it's not the best Zelda game anymore. There have been better Zelda games, but there have never been greater Zelda games. And in my mind, I'm not sure there's ever been a greater video game. Maybe there have been some that are on that level, but even then I'm not so sure because, video games now are really incremental. That wasn't the case back then. Back then, we really got to experience something that no gamers before had ever gotten to experience, and no gamers since have gotten to experience either. Not to that degree. We got to see for the first time video games grow up. And, you know, we can argue about where games have gone since then, and whether or not it's been all good, and whether or not maybe video games need some of that juvenile excitement once again. But it's hard for me to look back at Ocarina of Time as anything but the most important, the most groundbreaking, the most transformative, and really the greatest video game that I've ever played. And I know there aren't as many of us that think that anymore. It used to be kind of a universally accepted truth. That's not really the case anymore. But the more I think about it, you know, I used to feel bad for the kids today that weren't able to experience that and weren't open to the blessing of that truth of Ocarina of Time. I used to feel bad about that. But now I kind of understand. You have to let the kids have their Ocarina of Time. You know, in the same way the Atari 2600 seemed outdated to an NES kid growing up, I can see why Ocarina of Time, I can see why someone would tweet me, a younger person, and say, dude, what's the big deal about Ocarina of Time? I may want to explode. I may be furious inside that someone would dare besmirch the name of Ocarina of Time. But I get it. And I think I've come to a point where I think that's one of the beautiful things about gaming. Every generation is going to have their ocarina. And rather than sort of soapbox about why my ocarina is better than your ocarina, I think the best thing is that I can listen to you explain in the same impassioned excitement about why your ocarina is your ocarina. Although, I will say, your ocarina doesn't have a water temple.